Welcome back, book nerds. This is Library Card, the show for people who want to think deeply about what they're reading and get inspired to read more. I'm Megan Glayona. I'm here with Brian Brinkman and RJB. And today we're launching a new series. We're going to be diving into short stories. And we have a super cool collection that we're starting with this week. We're going to talk about a story called Infect Your Friends and Loved Ones from Stag Dance by Torrey Peters. Do you guys read a lot of short stories? Is this part of your regular routine?
It used to be. I read a lot in college. I think when I first started reading George Saunders, the only way, other than his nonfiction essays, were through short stories. And so I read a lot of those, which I think we'll talk about at some point. Um, my entry point to like Hemingway and Fitzgerald in high school and early college was through their short stories. And then for whatever reason, I kind of stopped. I don't really know why, because as we're going to talk about, reading this made me think I need to read a lot more short stories. And it is maybe starting this movie versus TV debate I have now is going to like spill over into short story versus novel debate. TBD, stay tuned. But love the format when it works.
How about you, RJ?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, kind of same. I mean, I think I read tons of short stories growing up. It feels like a good and kind of easy way to teach people how to appreciate stories. Not like they're
Mhm.
easy to do or understand, but I think it's like a good medium because you can get a 10-page story, but with still the same amount of insight and everything else, like from a teaching perspective. So I feel like, yeah, Hemingway and Fitzgerald, and I guess was that 2 years ago that Amor Tolls, was that last year? Table for Two, I think it was last year, which was like his one novella and a few short stories. That was probably the first one that I'd read in a long time, like a collection, and I was like, oh, this is awesome. Um, and now I'm reading a lot of short stories for many reasons and enjoying them.
It's so weird. I've never really read short stories. Obviously, I did in school, but I've never really been into them. I had a New Yorker subscription for so long, and I would always skip over the short stories, which is bizarre and embarrassing because I'm a huge fiction reader, but I don't know why. I always just felt like it was going to disappoint me in a way. And then
Mm.
I just felt like I wasn't going to be as invested. And then a few years ago, I think I was talking to you about this, Brian, and you recommended Saunders, The 10th of December, and I read it and I loved it and kind of opened my eyes to this. And I really, really enjoyed this story as well. And I'm excited to read this collection. So maybe this is a whole new thing for me. We'll have to see.
Whole new you. I think it's a totally different structural thing than writing a novel. And I think as we will talk about through here, to make it successful, you kind of have to be willing to um trust your reader in a way and understand that
Mhm.
you're going to have to sacrifice some elements that would be better filled out in an overall novel. But if you can if you can hit that kind of sweet spot of just enough information, not too much, pulling your reader along, it's such an enjoyable experience. Did you find, Meg, with the New Yorker, was it like, because I used to subscribe to the New Yorker and I always just found if I got like half an issue behind, my life fell apart because how am I ever going to catch up on this? What am I going to do? Was that the reason why you skipped over, or was it you mentioned maybe like you wouldn't be fully satisfied?
Yeah, a little bit. My family used to make fun of me because every time I'd go anywhere, I'd have like 3 New Yorkers with me of being like, "Well, I'm a little bit backed up, I gotta get through these." And so that was something to kind of skip that I would feel okay skipping. I also feel like every one of my conversations for years contained the phrase, "Well, I just read in the New Yorker, blah, blah, blah." And every day I kind of lament that I don't have time for the New Yorker anymore. So I look forward to the day when I have time for the New Yorker again. But yeah, I think that was part of it, and I like to commit to something for a long time. That's just kind of who I am, and so I think a short story always made me feel like I wasn't gonna be able to commit the way I wanted to, but I
Yeah,
committed to this story, and it was
this
worth it.
story is great. I just want to tell you guys. Well, first of all, the saying, Megan, that novelists are failed short story writers and short story writers are failed poets. Right? Have you heard that
Oh my,
before?
I did not know that, no, but I love that. That's
Yeah.
so
So
true. I
it's
know,
it,
and
it's
as
kind of like,
someone who appreciates economy in writing and in art too. I should really appreciate that.
Well, so in that saying, poetry is at the top of the food chain, and everyone
It's
else
the
is just
apex. Every
Well, you know
word
how I feel
matters.
about that.
yeah.
Yeah.
I
I
will
100%
say,
agree with that.
just on a podcast front, the New Yorker fiction podcast where they have authors reading other authors' short stories that have appeared in the New Yorker and then discussing them. It's pretty amazing. It's a pretty
Yeah.
awesome listen. So
Okay,
quick
I'm
plug.
gonna check that out. It's gonna make me want the New Yorker again, which is gonna be a whole new problem in my life, but I'm willing to go there. All right, let's get into this story. We're going to be talking about Infect Your Friends and Loved Ones by Torrey Peters. This story imagines a sci fi future where people have been infected with a virus that makes them unable to produce hormones. So everyone must inject hormones and thereby have the opportunity to choose their own gender. The country has kind of fallen apart over this, and it's a very post apocalyptic world with government distributed estrogen only for women of promising fertility and black market hormones that are hard to find. Torrey Peters is a trans author, and her bestseller, Detransition Baby, was chosen as one of the New York Times 100 best books of the 21st century. And before that book was published, she was in a collective of trans authors in Brooklyn, and she self-published 2 novellas, The Masker and Infect Your Friends and Loved Ones. And she sold enough copies of these for mainstream publishers to take an interest in her. And both of these stories appear in Stag Dance. And then she wrote 2 other stories as well after Detransition Babies that are included in Stag Dance as well. And one thing that's really interesting is that all of the stories in Stag Dance are from different genres. And Peters explains that she did that to kind of demonstrate how trans stories aren't just niche, but they can also transcend genre. And that's kind of where I wanted to start the conversation today. I was really interested and intrigued by how she uses the convention of genre. She uses flashbacks and time shifts and giving some information, but not all of it, and the slang of the post apocalyptic world to kind of deliver a story in familiar packaging, while also teaching you a lot about a person's perspective and a group of people's perspectives, and also how different the perspectives are within that group. So I wanted to ask you both how you felt about her use of genre and if it was effective for you.
In just in this as it
In this
pertains to this
story,
story.
yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the whole idea of like a trans apocalypse is like pretty wild as a premise, or like the
Yeah.
idea that like this, and obviously there'll be spoilers of some kind, but like the idea that this was like created so that everyone could or would have to, depending on your perspective, choose their own gender is just like it's a crazy way of turning like a choice into a necessity, which is like sort of a hallmark of an post-apocalyptic thing. It's like the things that you used to have to, the things that you used to be able to like choose to do or not do, you had to do, and
Mhm.
usually in like it's like survive zombies or whatever. But in this story, it's just a totally different. It's a way of like turning the whole thing on its head, which is just it's just wild to me. Like just the origin of like taking this biological event, but it was like created so that people would be able to or have to choose their gender. It's just like it's wild. So I think it takes this like post-apocalyptic thing and then like kind of turns it completely upside down.
It also flips like a current political issue on its head, and this idea of like fear of the other, this idea of fear of choosing something that is supposed to be or perceived as, you know, God given, if you will, from like the political argument. That now the choice is everyone's to make, and now the choice is everyone has to make it one way or the other. And you kind of spin out what that would look like if that world were to be created, where now this minority population that is oppressed and, in many ways ridiculed, looked down upon, so many worse things as well. Now they are the essentially like the dominant population, but they're still minority in numbers. And now everyone has to experience what they are going through. And like spinning that out, you just get layers upon layers as you're reading through this. And I think it is really complemented by the fact that you chose to write this book or this story as a sci-fi post-apocalyptic kind of thriller, if you will, that bounces back and forth through time because the pacing of it is so fast. There's
Mhm.
like a casualness, there's like a sarcasm throughout it. There's humor that allows you to really kind of live in this world while really awful things are happening all around you, combined with the current, climate of our country and what all, what this all means. I don't know. She just did a really effective job of like, you could read this story as one thing, you could read it as a completely different thing as well. She gave you the opportunity to both enjoy it while also examining yourself, examining, close political issues and instabilities, large scale societal fears, all of this kind of, individual one-on-one relationship. She just figured out a way to do this in 70 pages that was incredibly impressive, and utilizing sci-fi there as a manner to do this and post-apocalyptic terror was just like such an effective tool for me as I read through it.
Yeah, I found that really interesting how, part of your attention in the story is putting together what happened, right? Understanding like what's happened in the world. And that's any of these post-apocalyptic sci-fi thrillers. You're trying to figure out like what was the event? How did it affect people? How are people reacting? What do these words mean? Who's on top? Who's trying to get what? But then while she's doing it, she's somehow very almost casually, but really effectively talking about the dynamics between trans women and cisgender people that they're in relationships with, and talking about the layers of how desire can be really confusing for people. And that I found one thing that was really interesting is the unintentional cruelty that the character keeps coming up against in their relationships with cis men who are trying to understand their attraction to a trans woman. And I felt like that the layering of that's such a complicated issue, and the way that she's able to discuss that within this really complicated story, but it never feels forced, to me is just fascinating.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
like yeah, go ahead, Brian.
I was just going to comment that the scene where she goes on the date and the guy basically spends the whole conversation unveiling his trauma to her was
Yeah.
just like that was really effective in terms of like without explaining what she was trying to say there. It just gave you this experience that you know I don't know. It says a lot without saying too much. I found it really impressive.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's consistent through most of her writing is just the kind of like fluidity of gender, sexuality, and experience. There's no real, like, I think we want to, as humans, we want to like put things into categories and understand how things are in like, this is what cis people are like, this is what trans people are like. But I think through all of her stories and her books, it's basically like nothing is really black and white. And there's just like
Mhm.
constant gray areas between all this stuff. And one thing that's interesting in here that comes up more in the last story of the collection is just this like the relationship. When I wonder what you thought about this, Megan, like the relationship of trans women to the like idea of femininity, because it's a it's like a something that you aspire to kind of, but also like are so, I think, limited by in so many ways. It's an interesting dynamic about how that comes up in this story, especially in like the flashbacks. But I don't know. I think she like does a good job of kind of trying to show how crazy that relationship is.
Absolutely, and I think it brings to mind something that may sound really stupid, but all of this kind of comes down to this, and it's like, how would I talk to a 3rd grader about this? Because I teach 3rd grade, and we always say, like, "You get to be the kind of woman or girl you wanna be, and you get to be the kind of boy or man you wanna be." And I think she's really good at thinking about or talking about that gender identity is, like you were saying, RJ, it's not black and white. It is whatever you want it to be. And desire and gender identity are not binary. And there's not two ways to be those ways. That there's such a huge range. And that's what's so amazing, I think, is that I think that that idea really scares a lot of people because it means that they would have to actually question what they really want and why they want it. And I think she talks about that a little bit when the character is in relationships with cis men who are married or have other relationships with women, but they're dating her as a way to kind of find out what this attraction is. And I think it's really interesting because it's something that you don't read a lot about. And for me personally, I haven't read a lot about it. And I felt so it opened up my mind a lot about the way that even when we intellectually want to understand that, we still need to hear these stories to really internalize them and understand that idea that it is not just something that's binary. And what a beautiful thing that is, because it just opens up so much of an ability for us to express ourselves in a way that is just much more open and beautiful. And I think that she does such a great job of that. I was really struck by that, and also by this scope that she presents of feelings and behaviors within the trans community, and highlighting the diversity within this group. Like, there's not just one way to be a trans woman, and there's not just one way that trans women treat each other. I think that that's so hard to express, and I think she does such a nice job with that.
Yes, she
Yeah.
does an amazing job of giving you this sense that there are not just these binary perspectives of relationships, of tragedy, of loss, of confusion, that there's, um, you know, just a plethora of different ways that people can consume this, and it really comes down to individuality there. I thought one thing, this kind of idea of choice and what it means to live in the world that you want to live in. You really get that as the book spins out, and the fact that it keeps bouncing back and forth from prior to the contagion moment when this virus starts to spread, to a year, 2 years, 5 years, 7 years, I think is the furthest that we get from. I think that's when the book begins, 7 years post contagion. You get this real sense of like, a choice is made, these are the ramifications that come off of it, and this is the, like, we move from a black and white perspective into so many different colors, so many different ideas of, how someone is gonna survive with loss of resources, with loss of the ability to, um, repopulate the earth in a way. That then, like, when you think about that in the current state of things, um I think it does a really good job of removing, and I say this as someone who mainly reads a lot of straight white male stuff, like, just admittedly, like, that just, like, that's where that's a lot of the literature I read. Um, it removes this, like, very specific perspective into, it's almost as though, like, I felt reading the book like I was putting on, um, like, different colored glasses every time I was, like, moving through pages, moving through a new chapter, and just understanding the world from a perspective that I felt really uneven in and unsettled in a way, but I was also, like, finding myself really enlightened by as I was reading through it.
Yeah. Yeah. I just want to just point out quickly. I mean, I think, there's a comment from VT to boot about we're going to be pigeonholed as a DEI pod for talking about James and now this. But I do think just it's not the way that she writes is not like it's not a political kind of statement. I mean, I guess everything is in some way,
Right.
but like her writing is amazing. And one of the kind of things that, like, there's symbolism in here that I think is interesting. Like, the idea of scars comes up like at the very
Yeah.
beginning and at the very end, which I think to trans people is like a thing that, you know, people live with in various ways. But then, like, at the end of the story, they're like looking at their scars, which are from like them trying to survive this post-apocalyptic world, which I think is interesting because they're like putting, it's basically like everyone now lives in this world of having to like survive, whereas at the beginning it's very much like there's people who are just surviving because they can easily, and then there's people who are fighting to survive. And now, like, in this post apocalyptic world, they're like everyone has to try to survive, and everyone has to make a choice of, what gender identity they want. It's really interesting, and I think like the writing itself really kind of like is really a testament to the topic. It's not just like here's here's a bunch of political kind of statements or ideas. It's just really great writing that has a lot of good symbolism and a lot of really interesting characters in it.
Yeah, and I would say also that this is not a story about being trans. Like, there are trans characters and there's a trans element to it, but this is a story about, to me, about community and about the importance of community and how much this community has given to the main character, and how I thought it was really interesting how in the end, when she apologizes to Lexi, for how she treated her, and you think in that conversation that Lexi's gonna apologize to her for, this is a huge spoiler alert, but for infecting her and starting this virus, but instead she apologizes, and you realize that she's been really thinking about how she was maybe using that relationship just when she was feeling weak and needed support, and not being there for her the way that she wanted her to be there for her as like a romantic partner. And I think that was really interesting to me because it made me realize that this is mostly a story about friendship and how people within a community, even when they identify so deeply with a part of themselves, still are so different, and how we find connection within those communities.
Yeah, and I mean, what you guys are talking about stylistically and like what kind of story this is, like my connecting piece to how do I understand the world that this author is writing was Kurt Vonnegut, because it reads
Mm,
and it moves like a Vonnegut story in the sense that it has these big ideas, these big themes, this big symbolism that it's trying to make, almost so much so that like it at times feels like it's like slapping you in the face, but it's doing that almost kind of like with a wink, and it also is like injecting humor, injecting kind of a really casual way of speaking about really
mhm,
challenging issues, um, and just like throwing uh, jargon out at you that you don't fully understand until maybe 30 or 40 pages later, and then you can go back and kind of consume again because it's a really quick read, to be completely honest.
yeah,
Um, but I feel like that style breaks down a lot of the challenging aspects of this and allows you to you could pick this up and read this as a sci-fi short story without ever thinking about, I mean, I don't know if you could avoid the larger symbolic issues, but, like, you could read it as one thing versus another without feeling like it's, overtly saying, and I think this is part of the point of her larger project as a writer, is that trans stories are everyone's stories,
mhm.
and, this sense that you don't pigeonhole this, don't put this into a corner just because you think of it as one thing, it's actually a number of different things all in one.
Absolutely. I think she did an amazing job with that, and I'm really excited to read more of her stories. I think we're gonna be back next week or soon with another one of her stories. What are we gonna read next, RJ? Have we decided this?
Yeah, well, we have next week. We're just amping up our library card output. We have a book next week, which is Safekeep, and then the
Oh,
following
right.
week we're going to talk about the second story from here, which is called The Chaser. We got a
Awesome.
lot. We got a lot of book
I hope
talk.
everyone is ready for the, heat of the safekeep because my goodness.
I know I am. I love that book so much.
Whew.
If you have not dived into the Sea Keep Dove something, I don't know, but if you have not entered that world, I would highly recommend you do it before we talk about it, because this is my choice, my first book that I've brought that we're bringing in to the library card and universe, and I'm pretty excited about it. It's going to be a fun
Th
conversation.
This is your second. Let's hold
It
off
is?
there. This is your
What
second.
was
We
my
talked about Clara.
first?
We talked about Clara.
Okay, it's my second.
Megan is just,
Perfect.
she's always the underdog.
Always,
Just,
always.
Always. I've got to pitch myself that way, or what else do I have? All right, everybody, thanks for joining us as we had our first foray into short stories, and we'll be back soon. So thanks for checking us out. We'll see you soon.